The Green River Killer preyed on prostitutes and runaways around Seattle.
These are killing fields for the serial killers. These are easy pickings.
The final tally of his murders will never be known.
We think that he killed somewhere between 70 and 80.
He was killing 4 or 5 a month.
And the police couldn't arrest him for 20 years.
He had his killing career, and he had the rest of his life, where he was a father, and he was a husband, and he was an employee.
Eventually, a forensic lab was able to give the Green a name.
I said, Tom, are you trying to tell me we know who it is?
Gary Leon Ridgway is charged.
Serial killer Gary Ridgway was certainly a deranged killer. The Green River runs south of the city of Seattle. People go to the river to fish, to work, to play. One man went there to dump the bodies of women he had killed. It was the summer of 1982 when the river released its first victims.
Everybody was terrified. You know, I mean, these were places where we picnicked, where we swam, where children ran free. I mean, the first body was found by 2 little kids on bicycles.
On July the 15th, 1982, 2 children spotted a naked body snagged on debris under a bridge. Her name was Wendy Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old runaway. She had been strangled. 4 weeks later, the naked body of another young woman, Deborah Bonner, was found drifting face down in the river. She had also been strangled.
Everyone was rather mystified. I mean, they thought, is this the work of more than one person? And where does it begin and where does it end? And how could this be?
3 days later, on August the 15th, a man was taking a leisurely trip down the Green River when he came upon a strange sight.
What at first he described as a mannequin. Then he saw 2 and he thought that, well, that's a little strange that 2 mannequins would be weighted down with rocks next to the river. And as he drifted closer, he discovered they were deceased human beings.
These victims were identified as Cynthia Hines and Marcia Chapman. They were sub-shallow water, held under by boulders. King County Detective Dave Reichart, who had worked on the Deborah Bonner case, was the first investigator on the scene.
Marcia Chapman was in the water, laying on her back. One of her arms were free, and those rushing by was causing her hand to wave back and forth. It was almost as if she were calling to me for help. You know, like, here I am, please help me.
As Detective Reichart made his way down the bank towards the bodies, he almost tripped over yet another victim, splayed out in the tall grass. She was 16-year-old Opal Mills.
Deborah Bonner showed up on August 12th in the river, and then on August 15th, 3 more bodies showed up. We certainly knew we had a serial killer.
The killer seemed to have placed the bodies as if they were mannequins and not people. Small rocks were inserted in the orifices of 2 of them. The police thought it might be what is called a signature, a way for the killer to uniquely mark his work.
In the river, there is some sort of attempted posing going on and a signature that's being laid out. But what do the rocks mean? Only what's inside his mind knows that.
Before his grisly discovery, the boater had an encounter with a mysterious man standing on the riverbank.
He waved at this white male, and there was a brief greeting exchanged, have a nice day, and the person on the riverbank got into a pickup truck, according to this witness, and drove off.
Dave Reichart and his crime scene investigators combed through the trees and grass and along the sides of the riverbank for evidence, for something that could point to the killer.
Each crime scene that you go to, you know you're walking in his footsteps, and you are trying to put yourself in his shoes. What did he do? Where did he walk? What was he thinking?
The investigators' painstaking approach revealed critical pieces of evidence.
One of the first amazing pieces of evidence that we collected was bodily fluid. Spermatozoa was collected and placed in a test tube and frozen. The second interesting piece of evidence that was collected was a blouse that was probably about a quarter of a mile downriver from the body sites. It was all alone.
The blouse was found near a road where people often dumped rubbish.
So for us to take that blouse was very fortuitous, as we discover later.
Another crucial piece of evidence had been recovered from the first victim before the police knew that they were dealing with a serial killer.
The third piece of evidence that we collected was off of Wendy Caulfield, and that was a ligature that was kept.
What they gathered from the bodies and Green River would eventually lead to the capture of the killer. But it would take 20 years, and in these 2 decades, the killer would murder at least 48 women. In the summer of 1982, the naked bodies of young women were being found frequently near Seattle, Washington. The first bodies were found floating in a local river, and so the media called this serial murderer the Green River Killer. There seemed to be no end to the murderous rampage.
Police and searchers have found several pieces of evidence that may or may not be linked to the dead women or their killers.
More human remains were found at the site yesterday afternoon.
In the wake of the killings, fear quickly spread through the quiet suburbs on the banks of the Green River. The King County Police and other local law enforcement agencies launched a major investigation. They put the river under observation, but word got out, and the surveillance turned up nothing.
It was reported on the news that we were going to have surveillance. He quit using the river to place his victims. He learned a lot from all of us, unfortunately.
A month after the women were found, a 6th body was discovered in a wooded area frequented by prostitutes near the Seattle airport. Police determined that 17-year-old Giselle Lavaughn had disappeared within days of the original Green River victims. Death was also by strangulation. All the women were runaways, or prostitutes known to work the seedy red light district along the Pacific South Highway, the area where they had last been seen.
You give me any city where you have prostitution, where you have drug addicts, where you have throwaways. These are killing fields for the serial killers. These are easy pickings.
The killer seemed to have a particular interest in prostitutes. It could have been personal, or he could have chosen these victims simply because they were easy to find and easy to kill.
The victims were very vulnerable, young girls and young women. We found young girls on the street working as prostitutes as young as 11 years old.
The evidence investigators had assembled wasn't enough to generate any firm leads.
It's a prostitute. You find hair and fiber evidence. You find evidence of semen. We don't know if that evidence is coming from a John she was with earlier that night or if it's coming from the actual offender.
To make matters worse, the media attention surrounding the case seemed to be keeping the killer one step ahead of the investigation.
They find victims in the river, and so he goes to land, basically. So I think he was always paying attention as to how to tweak his strategy, his techniques. He matured in how he was hunting. He was becoming more cunning. He was killing 4 or 5 a month.
The body count grew steadily. By the end of 1983, 13 bodies had been found, and 24 more women were reported missing. After the first victims were found in the Green River, the killer changed his methods. Victims were discarded in remote wooded areas. Detectives linked the deaths of more than 20 women. Many of the bodies were found in groups.
His style, his desire was to put bodies in clusters. It helped him remember where they were. And so if he wanted to drive by and relive one of the killings, he would be able to relive 6 or 7. We discovered he was positioning the body's lower extremities in a way that would strongly suggest that he was having sex with the dead bodies.
The women most at risk were particularly apprehensive.
It scares me, but there's nothing I can do about it. I'm down here and I have to live with it.
The pressure intensified on the police to find the serial killer. In 1984, the Green River Task Force was formed with a staff of 50 and a hotline to take tips from the public.
Green River Task Force, may I help you?
With so few clues, the investigators had to spread their net wide.
We get a list of every person who is registered owner of a pickup truck. We get a list of every person who has been arrested for patronizing a prostitute.
To get a better idea of the sort of person they were searching for, the police consulted with the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit. Then in its infancy, the unit used interviews with known predators to develop profiles that might help lead police to serial murderers.
The profile kind of indicated to us that this person would be a white male, that he would be someone who is not able to hold a steady job, someone who is not able to keep his family and a marriage together.
I did a profile, and I believe that the subject was familiar with that area, so he's an outdoor type of person. I believe that the subject would have injected himself into the police investigation if they got close to him. He would have contact on the strip where these prostitutes operate and would talk to him.
The police compiled an extensive list of suspects.
One of the scary things is that as we collected tip sheets and we discovered that there were a lot of men out there who sort of fit different aspects of the profile. So we had 12 to 15,000 suspects that we were looking at.
Many victims weren't reported missing until long after their remains were found, making it difficult to identify them or trace their movements.
When a victim is missing, they don't know now if she's gone to another city. They operate in area of prostitution from Anchorage, Alaska down to San Diego. So it makes it very, very difficult.
Prostitutes were disappearing from an area populated by people who didn't make the best witnesses.
A lot of them didn't want to talk to us in the first place because they had their own problems with the law. So not only did they not want to be found, they were difficult to find because they too had different names, birth dates, and changed their appearances.
Every day we left that office, there were photographs of 20, 30, 40 women who had fallen victim to this man or were missing. And for all of us, that was a reminder that you can't give up.
One woman did offer some significant evidence. Rebecca Garday had gone off with a man in a pickup truck in 1982.
He refused to do anything in the truck. You know, I don't want to go up there in the woods. Something's going on wrong. I was very nervous. I was shaking. And he says, well, if you don't go up there, well, you're not going to do it then. So I followed him up there. He got mad at me immediately and said I bit him. And he got a hold of my neck. He was trying his hardest to make me not breathe. Hands around my neck, hands around my face. It was the most horrible scare I ever had.
Somehow, she managed to break loose and escape.
He doesn't speak while he's doing that. It's his face that I remember. Just the way that he, surprised me with that attack.
Rebecca went to the police in 1984 and identified the picture of a suspect police had in their files. The man she picked out was Gary Ridgway. Her identification didn't come as a complete surprise to investigators. Their interest was first drawn to Ridgway shortly before the bodies had been recovered from the Green River in 1982. He had been swept up in a Vice Squad sting operation, soliciting an undercover officer for sex. But Ridgway, who was a divorced father with a steady job, didn't seem to fit the profile of a serial killer.
And here he was, stable worker, always showed up on time. He had been married a couple times, so he wasn't your perfect suspect.
They had come to these notions at that time that serial killers were generally mobile, had transient jobs at best. limited education, loners, didn't have families. So none of those things fit some of the people they were eyeing as good potential suspects.
The next time Ridgway's name came up was 1983, when a man saw Marie Malvar getting into a pickup truck.
He doesn't think that she looks like she's feeling very comfortable with this guy as he sees her face through the windshield, and she disappears into the night.
He told Marie's family, who managed to trace the pickup to Ridgway's house. When she didn't return, they went to the police.
He was caught after having picked up Marie Malvar and confronted by police officers at the time regarding her potential disappearance. But he was able to talk his way out of that one.
He was able to talk his way out of Rebecca Gardet's assault charge, too. He claimed that she had bitten him and he had defended himself. He wasn't held. Gary Ridgway was a prime suspect, but there was no conclusive evidence against him.
Ridgway, of course, is on the list of registered pickup truck owners. He's on the list of people who patronized prostitutes. We have a detective interview him, and of course he denies any involvement.
He was called in by the task force on several different occasions to be interviewed, and even though he had killed a woman 3 weeks before one of the major interviews by the task force, he displayed no signs of nervousness.
Ridgway even passed a polygraph test.
The polygraph test is based upon one's guilty emotions. And if you don't ever feel guilty about what you've done, you're going to be able to pull the wool over somebody's eyes.
Would always say, do I look like the Green River Killer? I mean, he's a smaller built, framed man who is not intimidating at all, really an unassuming sort of personality and appearance.
Meanwhile, the killings continued. At times, the Green River Killer seemed to be mocking the police.
And he says, hey, I'm doing pretty good. They form a task force, they come after me, they can't catch me or anything else. And I think he starts playing more of a game of moving pieces around. He's moving skeletons around, he's moving bodies around.
The Green River Killer covered up the crimes. He destroyed evidence. He cleaned the body of any kind of trace evidence that he might have accidentally left. He prevented himself from leaving fingerprints, and where he might have, he cleaned that up. So we have a clever criminal who knows full well that the police are searching desperately to find him.
After 1984, the number of bodies discovered suddenly decreased. Some claimed that the Green River Killer had gone, but he had only changed his methods. He stopped clustering bodies, and he began to dump remains further away in Oregon, the adjacent state.
He's going back to decomposed sites and taking skeletons away. That must have something to do with trying to confuse the police.
In 1987, the authorities stepped up their interest in Gary Ridgway after a tip came in from another prostitute.
We come back to him again, and escape of one of the prostitutes who describes him gives us a little bit more information.
Based on this new first-hand account, detectives decided to focus on the pickup trucks Ridgway drove, trying to prove he was cruising for women in the red light district on the days the victims disappeared.
We checked out how many miles it would take to drive to and from work every day and how much that would normally burn up. Well, he was burning up many, many gallons of gas, way beyond, and that's just what he was charged, let alone what he might have been paying for in cash. The deeper we looked at Ridgway, the more it became obvious that he was available for every single one of those dates.
Investigators got a warrant to search Ridgway's home, hoping to find evidence that would tie him to the killings. He also had to give detectives a sample of his saliva on a piece of gauze.
1987, still no DNA science then, but we froze that piece of gauze.
The search of the house came up empty, even though many years later, Ridgway would admit to killing several of his early victims there.
According to Miss Ridgway, he killed all of the women in his bedroom. His practice was as soon as he finished killing them, he would often take the sheets off his bed, throw them in the washer even before he left with the woman's body. So he left behind nothing, essentially.
His neighbors speculated about the variety of things he would dispose of.
He had huge garage sales, and he'd have just gobs of stuff.
I guess the kind of funny thing I always saw was a lot of jewelry, a lot of young girls' jewelry, and a lot of mixed pairs of shoes. I didn't understand that.
Yet no one seemed to think that Gary Ridgway could be leading a monstrous double life.
If I were to try to think of what Gary Ridgway's daily routine was, I would say that it was death and sex, and it was in his soul. It wasn't a career, it wasn't a passion, that was his soul. Every moment, when he ate, when he slept, when he even probably made love to his wife, he was thinking of killing and abusing a woman in the woods. That's his day.
He became what I called a serial killer savant. He was not necessarily very good at anything else, but he could stalk and kill with the best of them.
Gary Ridgway remained a free man.
Even though he was a prime suspect, one of probably the top 5 suspects that the original Green River Task Force had in the 80s, he still lived his life throughout the 80s and 90s doing what he was doing.
We didn't hold him when we had him in 87. We didn't hold him when he was contacted in 84 and 83. So he had to have felt that he was winning.
Without enough evidence to charge Ridgway and with fewer bodies being discovered, the Green River Killer case slid onto the back burner. Gradually, the task force wound down and the personnel were transferred to other duties. By 1991, only one detective remained.
As time passed, I became the only person there. I knew it was my duty. It reached a point where I really didn't know where I would go if I was gone.
Tom Jensen became the keeper of the flame. The evidence that investigators had painstakingly acquired at multiple crime scenes over the years had been carefully catalogued, preserved, and stored. It awaited the day when forensics would advance sufficiently to point an accusatory finger at Gary Ridgway and make the charge that he was the Green River Killer stick. In the 1990s, the Green River Killer faded from the headlines. Police didn't find any more bodies as the killer became more careful about hiding them. The last detective on the case, Tom Jensen, was patient, waiting for DNA testing to improve enough so that he could submit some of the old evidence for more sophisticated forensic tests. He wanted to compare it to a DNA sample detectives had taken from one of their prime suspects years before, Gary Ridgway. DNA from his saliva and the sperm taken from the victims could not be definitively matched by 1980s techniques.
We were told the science wasn't quite there yet. Your samples are minimal and they're very unstable and they could be destroyed when we test them again. So wait for the science to be right.
The technology today can actually get a result with that kind of DNA, whereas the technology back in '87 could not. In fact, we have been able to test evidence more than 30 years old in criminal matters and get a complete profile with the current technology, whereas using the older technology, we probably would have gotten no results at all.
Because of the size of the sample and the condition that it was in, we figured we probably were going to have one shot at it. And we wanted it to be the best shot we could take. So those samples went back on the shelf, went back in the refrigerator for a number of years.
Meanwhile, Gary Ridgway had married for a third time in 1988.
When they first moved here, they were newlyweds, and you could tell they were very much in love with each other. They were always together, their eyes sparkled, they were always smiling.
Marriage slowed the pace of Ridgway's murder spree, but it didn't end his desire to kill. He left his victims' bodies in remote areas where many of them were never found. At the plant where he worked, Ridgway would play little games with his colleagues, leaving jewelry from his victims for them to find.
One of the employees picked it up, put it on, and had a real good find. In Gary's mind, I think he walked very quietly and had a little smirk on his face.
He had his killing career that he did out of sight from any other people, and he had the rest of his life where he was a father and he was a husband and he was an employee.
By 2001, forensics techniques had advanced sufficiently for Tom Jensen to unlock his carefully stored evidence and submit it to a lab.
So in 2001, we submitted our samples, the DNA from the riverbanks and the DNA from the gauze.
The modern technology uses a procedure called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and means is that a very small item of evidence, just the top of a pen worth of a blood stain, you can amplify that and make billions of copies of what was prior to that, maybe 1 or 2 molecules. So there's extraordinary capability of amplifying small amounts of evidence.
19 years after the lifeless hand of Marcia Chapman beckoned from her watery resting place in the Green River, samples taken from her and 2 other victims were sent to the Washington State Crime Lab.
There was spermatozoa there, and we were able to generate a male DNA typing profile that matched Gary Ridgway. It's really amazing, the profiles we got.
PCR analysis of STR DNA provides us with an extraordinary amount of information, even on old specimens, even on highly degraded specimens, even on minute specimens. And that is what did the Green River Killer in.
Finally, police had the evidence they needed to arrest the Green River Killer.
Tom Jensen comes to my office with 3 sheets of paper. The first piece of paper was telling me we had our first piece of physical evidence that connected somebody to this case. The second time he flipped the paper over, it was we have the same person responsible for 2. So it wasn't that we were just going to be able to solve one case and wonder about all the others still. Now we really had a chance to at least say we could connect one person to the bodies in the river.
The last lab report was in an envelope.
Tom was teary-eyed, I was teary-eyed, and I looked at Tom and I said, Tom, are you trying to tell me we know who it is? Who the Green River Killer is?
He didn't even have to open it. He immediately just picked it up and said, it's Gary Ridgway, isn't it?
We collected this evidence in 1982. We collected evidence in 1987. The DNA science starts to be developed in the late 1990s. And the fact that we could go back and take a look at the evidence collected so long ago and have science tell us with absolute certainty that it was one person out of the 12 to 15,000 suspects that we had. It was unbelievable.
On November the 30th, 2001, the criminal career of Gary Ridgway abruptly came to an end.
We drove up in an unmarked SUV, caught him as he was walking to his truck after work. The detectives got out of the car, advised him he was under arrest, and his reaction was very nonchalant. And he said one word, and that was, okay.
He asked no questions, he showed no emotion, complied with getting into the vehicle, and in the 20-minute ride back to our Justice Center, he only asked one question during the entire ride. What's going to happen to my truck?
Based on newly developed DNA evidence, Gary Leon Ridgway is charged with killing Marcia Faye Chapman, Carol Ann Christensen, Cynthia Gines, and Opal Charmaine Mills.
Despite the suspicions that placed him in the top 5 suspects since the late 1980s, how had Gary Ridgway managed to escape justice for so long?
He was good at what he did. He didn't leave a lot for us to work with. But a lot of people worked hard at collecting every little bit that was out there. And 20 years later, it paid off.
We did care. We did investigate. We did collect evidence. We could find all the evidence when this thing finally came to trial. We were ready.
In March 2003, investigators found another important piece of forensic evidence. Overalls taken from Gary Ridgway's locker at work in 1987 yielded microscopic paint traces from his job. They matched samples from the ligature around Wendy Caulfield's neck and from the blouse that had been found near the Green River in 1982.
We find out there's spray paint, which was chemically identical, at least, to the material that Gary Ridgway was working with at the plant where he worked. He was bringing paint particles, unbeknownst to him, into his vehicle, into his home, and that if victims were in his vehicle in his home, those would be transferred as well.
Now police and prosecutors could link Gary Ridgway to 7 cases, but dozens more women were believed to be among his victims. To get answers on the other cases, police and prosecutors struck a deal with Ridgway. If he told the truth about the killings, he could avoid the death penalty.
We could have moved ahead with 7 cases, and we could have taken a chance that he would have been found not guilty on those 7 cases, and we would not have known the answers to any other questions. So our choice was to agree to the deal, the plea bargain deal. He said that he would tell us about 65 cases.
Once the deal was sealed, began questioning the man they had pursued for 20 years. Among them was Detective Randy Mullinax, who had been with the case from the beginning.
When we went into the interview, we had all of the victims' photographs together and our information ready, and we learned within hours that he was not going to remember the faces. The faces of these little girls and these young women didn't mean anything to him.
They were something to have sex with and kill and take the money back.
The killing had started in 1982. Gary Ridgway was finally arrested in 2001. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to killing 48 women.
And Mr. Ridgway, is it your desire to plead guilty to the 48 charges of aggravated murder in the first degree? Because you believe that you are guilty of each of those offenses?
Yes.
It was all a part of a controversial deal. The killer's life in exchange for the truth about what happened to his victims and where those who were still missing might be found. But to get to that truth, investigators had to go on a dark journey deep into the mind of a serial killer. They spent 6 months with Gary Ridgway, taping every conversation, hundreds of hours worth.
All I wanted to do was kill him. Arm, when I head back there, I could put my knees in the back of her back.
Well, why did you want to kill him, Gary? Why? Why did you want a reef on their neck?
Because I didn't want them to get away. I wanted to have sex with them, and I wanted to kill him.
They saw a side of Gary Ridgway no one but his victims had ever seen before.
When you kill him right then, what are you thinking?
Thinking of taking the life of a worthless piece of trash.
The tapes show a killer both monstrous and mundane.
I get off work at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, and then go pick up a woman on the way home. And that way there I had the mornings free to go back and...
Ridgway only remembered his victims by virtue of what shift he was working when he murdered them in the course of his 30-year career painting trucks. He considered his body count to be his real and lasting lifetime achievement.
Boy, you just told me you were an 8 on a 10 of serial killers, right?
Yeah, but
That's pretty damn good, isn't it?
That's pretty good, yeah.
Where would you rank yourself? Do you think you're one of the best of all time?
According to the number, probably one of the best, yeah.
In terms of your own mind, where do you rate yourself?
I rate myself as probably number 1.
What's going through your mind? Describe the anticipation that's going on in your mind. I mean,
the knowing I'm going to kill him afterwards, and then my hate would jump in. My hate to kill him and not to have to pay for sex and I'd have sex with him again the day later or something like that.
He is a person, this is very clear, a person, in my opinion, has no remorse. That when he looked into my eyes and the eyes of other detectives and he said, I killed because I wanted to, I believe that.
Ridgway was secretly moved out of jail into police headquarters. There he lived in this small office for close to 6 months, sleeping on a bare mattress. He spent each day surrounded by the men and women who had once tried so desperately to catch him.
It was the strangest experience of 25 years in law enforcement. To walk into my office, to have him say good morning or good night to you for 6+ months, it was very strange for all of us.
Yeah, I had 20 years worth of questions and I plan on getting answers. How old were you when you killed your first human being? Quick, come on.
I don't remember how old, but it was in 82. No,
What's the answer to the question?
It wasn't always easy to get a straight answer.
This guy's a pathological liar, not only a psychopath with no feeling at all, but he has difficulty. He can't tell what's truth and what's a lie. He doesn't know the difference.
However, in the course of their interviews, investigators were able to gather important information. They learned, for instance, that as a teenager, Ridgway had stabbed a young boy, wounding him in the side.
Mr. Ridgway, according to the boy, and Mr. Ridgway admits this, said, I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill someone. And Mr. Ridgway laughed and walked away.
It would be...
Detectives also Ridgway had a difficult relationship with his mother. He was a bedwetter into his early teens and recalled her punishing him. He later developed intense lust for his mother combined with humiliation.
He talked about gazing on her as she sunbathed, and he had sexual fantasies about her. Almost in the same breath, Mr. Ridgway would say that he felt rage toward his mother, that he wanted to kill her.
When he was 21, Gary got married and joined the Navy. He was shipped out to the Pacific, and in the Philippines, he enjoyed the services of prostitutes and caught a venereal disease. Could his hatred of prostitutes have originated here? Or did he hate all women, but find prostitutes easy targets?
I hated women.
They also learned how he was able to convince so many young women to go with him, even at the height of the Green River Killer's attacks.
His M.O. would be to park his truck and look like he had car trouble, and then he would be approached by them. So he would kind of appear as non-threatening. And then they'd make a deal and they'd get in a car and they'd drive off.
In one shocking admission, Ridgway said he had used his young son as a decoy to suggest he was harmless when he was picking up one of his victims.
He drove her to a remote location, told the boy to stay in the truck, and then he disappeared into the woods with the woman and then came back without her. And his little boy asked, well, Dad, where's the girl? And he said, oh, she walked home. She lives near here.
And he actually said, if my son had seen anything, I would have had to kill him too.
In the end, detectives managed to extract satisfactory answers to every question but one.
Why did you kill? That's the million-dollar question, right? A lot of people ask,
because they were
in the hell did he do it?
Because they were prostitutes, and I killed him because I wanted to kill him.
He never gave us any clear answer about why on one particular day he decided to murder somebody.
It seemed that Gary Ridgway's spree had simply run out of steam as he got older.
We think that he killed somewhere between 70 and 80.
Gary counts 71 when he includes all the places he thinks that he has deposited bodies. We've searched a lot of those places and we have come up empty. There's nothing there. Whether time has just taken its toll and the remains are no longer there, or whether it's just a bad memory on his part, or even just leading us on.
Detectives were convinced
kidnapping and murder is a story of police dedication and the pioneering of forensic investigation in Australia. It's also a story of greed and inhumanity that caused an entire nation to grieve and tore apart a normal Australian family.
Get ready for the start of Investigation Discovery now, as Deranged Killers remembers the search for a mass murderer. It's also new at 10 when a trip to the cemetery brings more than 3 teenagers bargained for in a haunting.
Extraordinary lives, extraordinary stories. Films on Discovery coming soon.
You're watching Investigation Discovery, continuing at 10 with a brand new episode of A Haunting. Right now, though, follow the disturbing case of the Green River Killer.
The Green River Killer preyed on prostitutes and runaways around Seattle.
These are killing fields for the serial killers. These are easy pickings.
The final tally of his murders will never be known.
We think that he killed somewhere between 70 and 80.
He was killing 4 or 5 a month.
And the police couldn't arrest him for 20 years.
He had his killing career, and he had the rest of his life, where he was a father, and he was a husband, and he was an employee.
Eventually, a forensic lab was able to give the Green River Killer a name.
I said, Tom, are you trying to tell me we know who it is?
Gary Leon Ridgway is charged.
Serial killer Gary Ridgway was certainly a deranged killer. The Green River runs south of the city of Seattle. People go to the river to fish, to work, to play. One man went there to dump the bodies of women he had killed. It was the summer of 1982 when the river released its first victims.
Everybody was terrified. I mean, these were places where we picnicked, where we swam, where children ran free. I mean, the first body was found by 2 little kids on bicycles.
On July the 15th, 1982, 2 children spotted a naked body snagged on debris under a bridge. Her name was Wendy Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old runaway. She had been strangled. 4 weeks later, the naked body of another young woman, Deborah Bonner, was found drifting face down in the river. She had also been strangled.
Everyone was rather mystified. I mean, they thought, is this the work of more than one person? And where does it begin and where does it end? And how could this be?
3 days later, on August the 15th, a man was taking a leisurely trip down the Green River when he came upon a strange sight.
What at first he described as a mannequin. And then he saw 2 and he thought that, well, that's a little strange that 2 mannequins would be weighted down with rocks next to the river. And as he drifted closer, he discovered they were deceased human beings.
These victims were identified as Cynthia Hines and Marsha Chapman. They were submerged in shallow water, held under by boulders. King County Detective Dave Wright